Welcome, listeners, to our winter solstice episode, the last of 2025, and what a year it has been. Today, we are very happy to present José Leitão and Brian Johnson, who will be discussing their recent publication, 7 Magic Hours of Cyprian the Mage, a study and translation of manuscript 174 N155 from the Portuguese National Library, an Iberian book of pacts and treasure hunting. In today's episode, José and Brian describe the history of Cyprianic texts, the new discoveries of the French and Spanish influences which flowed into their translated grimoire, as well as the nature of the talismanic object described within its worn and damaged pages. If you enjoy this sort of conversation on the arts of the occult and esoteric, then please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We are very grateful for every little thing that you can do to help us grow and reach a wider audience. I am your host, Matt Hadfield, and I am honoured to welcome José and Brian back to the Hadean Press podcast. José and Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Matt, always good to be back.
Happy to be here, Matt.
Brian, I trust you're doing well?
Yeah, keeping busy.
Good. And José, you have several books published now through Hadean Press. You've been on the show before, interviewed by Elizabeth last year, but this is the first time that I've got the opportunity to speak to you. So I'm really happy that you got the chance to come on talk to me today. For our audience, could you describe a little bit about yourself and your research?
Yeah, okay. That's a long story, but I'll try to keep it short. So I'm a Portuguese guy who kind of grew up in your run-of-the-mill, like low middle class family, in a very typical, what we would call here, non-practicing Catholic family, meaning a culturally Catholic family, but we didn't really go to mass, just your occasional wedding, and was very much, my grandparents were very much immersed in Catholicism. For a time, they were very close to the bishop even. I grew up with these certain amount of stories about certain types of literatures and practices that for a long time I kind of dismissed, as a young person, who cares? But eventually growing up and becoming gradually more interested in life in general, started paying attention to some aspects of my upbringing, focused on mysticism and magic and mythology and folklore, and obviously at first as a hobby, as most people do, but eventually through a very long and complicated academic history, I ended up becoming a researcher and a historian on the topics of magic and magic literature in Portugal. And in that, leading up to that, and in that quality, I have been actively researching the books of Saint Cyprian since, 2010, something like that. Mm-hmm. And when I've been publishing most of the texts that I'm aware of, that I find in that note, and that I keep finding in that note. So, yes, that's it. Scholar, historian of magic right now.
And what was it that first captured your interest in the works of Saint Cyprian and with magic in general? Was there a moment?
Well, I do remember a couple of episodes that did bring Saint Cyprian to my attention and the literature. I remember being very young, not sure how old I was, hearing the first time about the book of Saint Cyprian. Still, I was in primary school or something, so not much I could do about it those days. But I remember hearing about it from my brother and his friends, that they saw a book of Saint Cyprian in the public library here in Leiria, and my grandmother immediately warned us never to touch that book. So that's my first memory of hearing about the books of St. Cyprian is that it's my grandmother admonishing me never to touch it. And then, you grow up, and then you go to college, and then you start meeting interesting people and having interesting conversations. And that's when the interest in magic came up. I'll have to admit, primarily as an intellectual pursuit, because it's most people would enter magic through contemporary magic practice, like Thelema or chaos magic or something like that. And while I always did find Aleister Crowley a very interesting author, Thelema as a system was never appealing. So I started becoming aware of magic through that lens, but never with the actual intention of practicing thalamic magic. But I was trying to find something. And then the current grimoire renaissance happened with Jake Stratton Kent, and lots of small publishers started showing up. Hadean started becoming preeminent in this period, and then that's when a lot of grimoire publications started coming up. And when that happened, and I connected the dots, I said, oh, obviously magic isn't just this highly intellectual contemporary thalamic chaos magic sphere. There's this whole other thing, and there's actually something here that connects to me in some way. And I started paying attention to the books of St. Cyprian, slowly at first, as this is a kind of a social problematic topic in Portugal. It wasn't just my grandmother warning me about not touching the books of St. Cyprian. There's a whole culture around the dangers of the books of St. Cyprian, and I was not immune to that culture, obviously. But in time, I did start paying attention to the book of St. Cyprian, and out of I suppose frustration, because it's a very complicated book, and there wasn't any information on how to not just how to work with it, but how to understand it from a historical perspective, from whatever perspective you wanna talk about. Out of the frustration of not having any information on that book, I started doing my own research, which eventually led me to start publishing about it.
So from like a layman's perspective, like from your grandma's perspective and other grandma's perspective, like how is the Book of Saint Cyprian generally or stereotypically understood by normal folk?
Well, back in those days, because I say back in those days because this semester, current semester, I've been teaching at the University of Coimbra, and I take any opportunity to talk about magic, so that to try to keep the classes lively. Turns out, current kids don't know anything about books of St. Cyprian. Most haven't even heard about that. But back in those days, it wasn't just my grandmother talking about it. Obviously, you would have like youngsters trading these like urban myths about the Book of St. Cyprian. The general impression was that it was cursed literature, not just by the virtue of the words written on it, of the information it contained, but it's a cursed literature, like the very object itself was cursed. That somehow, if you went into contact with this book in some form, weird things would start happening in your home and in your life, and your house would get haunted, and you would see the devil and stuff like that. Very not very specific, but it's like it's a cursed object, even if it's a printed commercially available object. This was the idea that just the mere contact with it would bring about like havoc in your life. My grandmother, besides this, she would also have a very concrete problem with it, because it is from its inception as a magic book and as a local magic book and as a magic book of problematic implications. It has always been actively combated by the Catholic Church in Portugal. And she, being an active Catholic, it wasn't just this urban aspect, this urban myth aspect to it. There were concrete religious problems that she had with it, and many other people had. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting and maybe like a little sad to have been, part of that, maybe that last generation of people who grew up with these folk tales and stories on the playground, cursed objects and magic. Yeah. And yeah, it was really interesting hearing about your perspective and your experience regarding that. Thank you. But yeah, we are here today to discuss your latest work through Hadean Press. Forgive me, I'm going to do my best to pronounce it correctly, but it's Cypriani Magici Septemhore Magicae, a study and translation of manuscript 174 N 155 from the Portuguese National Library, an Iberian book of pacts and treasure hunting. But to begin, could you explain exactly what the Cyprianic Grimoire tradition is and where does it fit into the broader European corpus?
It's a complicated story with blind spots that we don't know. Like I said, one of the reasons I started writing about books of Saint Cyprian was that there was no information on them. But from what we know these days, there are several places in Europe where you can say that a Cyprianic tradition exists. There is Scandinavia. There are some manifestations in Italy, and there are some in England. Al Cummings would be able to talk about that. Then there are a few that I genuinely don't know anything about. There are a few books in Armenia and Turkey and stuff like that, but I really cannot speak to those. And then you have Iberia as one of the hotspots where you have something that can be called the Cyprianic Grimoire tradition. Those are obviously the ones I focus on. What we know of these books in terms of history and how they relate to other forms of literature is that they seem to emerge likely in the late 16th century. We can trace back references to them, maybe 1590, something like that. Although specific mentions of people seeing books with those titles, not just references to them, but there was a book in this moment with this title that's early 17th century, so late 16th, early 17th centuries, when we start having coherent mentions to books with that would be called or that are called books of Saint Cyprian. Originally, it's hard to make out what was the content of these books, but the what is suggested by the documentation, and I'm talking about inquisitorial documentation, is that these were kind of collections of a folk nature, of certain prayers and procedures and banishments, mostly focused on health, mostly focused on well-being, as is the typical preoccupation of folk magic. And what appears to give these otherwise folk collections of remedies, what seems to give them this extra layer of coherence that they would acquire the title Book of St. Cyprian, is that these books would have, among its content, the prayer of St. Cyprian, which is this very relevant religious / magical text that shows up a bit all over Europe, and not only Europe. It's a very lengthy prayer that you are supposed to pray as speaking as if you are Saint Cyprian. So it's a very interesting type of prayer, and it's usually used to banish evil spirits. And you even have Arabic versions of this. And it was popular all over Europe. In Portugal, the Inquisition records have ample mentions to this prayer. So it seems that when people would collect their own collections of folk prayers and folk remedies, if among these they would collect a prayer of St. Cyprian, this would apparently give this collection the title Book of St. Cyprian. If we consider them like that, then there is a difficult argument to be made of how does this relate to the European grimoire tradition, because it's a folk product of the very specific context that throughout a lot of history does not seem to communicate with the rest of Europe. You find these instances in Portugal and Spain, but geographically, those regions are kind of isolated, particularly Portugal, because anything that would arrive at Portugal would have to go through Spain, and it didn't always go through. But obviously, you can't separate these from the global European tradition of grimoires, if nothing else, due to the Prayer of Saint Cyprian, which is a European wide distributed text. So where in areas where this prayer got traction, the accumulation of knowledge around those prayers would create Cyprian books. I would assume a similar situation is what happened in Scandinavia. So you have this underlying connection through the prayer of Saint Cyprian, then that throughout the modern period seems to allow for these books to crystallize. And then, as you arrive at 18th century and 19th century particularly, then you genuinely start having direct communication between these books and the rest of Europe, which mostly happens most visibly in Spain, because they have a much easier contact with France and Italy. And then you start having that, as the books of Saint Cyprian never had like a central canon of content, they're just usually collections. You will find several books that start having additions of material clearly derived from Italian and French grimoires. And there was, I don't think there still is, actively at least, there was a Cyprianic tradition also in France. We do know of a few titles. So sometimes you would have books show up in Spain as books in Cyprian that were actually French books. So but that's 18th, 19th century, before the crystallization of the books in printed form. So they started really communicating through that.
Yeah, Brian and Al were mentioning this cross-pollination when we were talking about the German Faustian grimoires a couple of months ago, and how the French manuscript materials were like traveling across borders, and there was this intermingling of texts going on at the time. So yeah, it's all connected in ways that but it's the specific tradition which we're really interested in talking about today. But you mentioned before that the earliest texts had like a medical focus. Was this connected in any way to astrology?
Medicine, obviously, as you know, in the early modern period is not an isolated subject, and obviously astrology has a part to play in it. Typically, at least in Portugal, when you are talking about these collections of folk medicine and folk magic, astrology tends to be downplayed, because we are really talking about like undereducated people, and astrology will typically have a learned component to it. Just the simple fact that you need to be able to calculate astrological times and be able to identify correctly which planet rises at the right time, or when is the sun exactly on which sign. Typically, these types of folk magic don't have that association with astrology like that. You do have something that there's a Portuguese researcher called Francisco Tencourt. He does mention that there is such a thing as folk astrology, which is a type of astrology that is more empirical, that less mathematical. It might have to do with the days of the week, for example. And in that sense, then yes, if we are looking at a more simple thing, not this elaborate mathematical science, sure, the Prayer of Saint Cyprian and the books of Saint Cyprian we do know of in the early modern period do put a lot of focus that the most fundamental of their, let's say, rituals, being healing rituals, should be performed on Sundays. You could consider this to be a form of folk astrology, although obviously it has religious connotations because it's Sunday, it's a holy day, but yeah, only connection to astrology only in that sense.
How about, I think you just touched on it there momentarily, but just generally speaking, people's literacy would have been very low at the time when these early books were being circulated, especially like you said, the very the 16th century, etc. Would the prayer of Saint Cyprian itself be something that would have been, for instance, like memorized by people? The memorization of it would be enough to carry the text. And like for instance, in early British magic, cunning folk, you find people who just own a book, and it's not necessarily a book of magic or something. It's just a book, but by having it in their possession, they somehow get this glamour of magical power or something that gets accreted to it.
Sure, yeah. Look, I'm not entirely sure about people memorizing the prayer. I don't think I've ever seen a reference to that. But the prayer was a lot, most often, I wouldn't say most often, but a lot of times transmitted as a talisman. And you do have people that were entirely illiterate and would have the prayer with them and would show it to other people so that they could make copies, and would themselves make copies, just drawing the letters, not knowing what they were writing. And in fact, one of the first registered mentions to a book of St. Cyprian, 1621, I think, the first book which we actually have some kind of description of the content. The owner of the book was illiterate, so it's exactly the same situation you were talking about. He saw a magic book, and he tells where he found it, and he was illiterate, didn't know how to read it. He was rather a well-to-do individual, a rich farmer, but the virtue of the magic book was in being a magic book in itself, not necessarily that he could read it. So he would use it as a source of authority, as a source of glamour, and as a talisman. And whenever he needed to actually read what was in it, like the prayer of St. Cyprian, he would find himself an assistant, either even his client, or he mentions his son could read, so he would have his son around. But yeah, so the prayer of St. Cyprian was indeed transmitted, not necessarily as something that you could read, but something that you could have as an object, with the same thing happening with the books of St. Cyprian among illiterate people. Sure.
Mm-hmm. There's some conjecture in your book about the nature of, is it the Libra de San Cipriano from 1610?
Yeah, that is one of the early mentions to books of St. Cyprian. So that is so that is the first document we have. It's from the Toledo Inquisition that mentions a book of St. Cyprian, although a later document, 1621, says that the guy being prosecuted had a book for the last 30 years. So he places the creation of his book late 16th century, but the first mention we get to a document talking about books of St. Cyprian is 1610. And that is the case of a guy called Juan de Toledo, who's a Morisco, is an ethnic group, the descendants of Iberian Muslims. And it's a guy it's a short document. It's mostly like a denunciation. So it's a short thing, and it's a guy that was found with a few magic books in his possession. Among them, one that they referred to by the explicit title of Book of St. Cyprian, or Libro de San Cipriano in Spanish. But it's not mentioned what the content of the book was or exactly what he was using it for, because he also had other books. And they do say that he was finding treasure, which is a very widespread type of magic practice. We don't know if he was finding treasure with the Book of St. Cyprian or with one of the other books. One of the other books is mentioned as having the title Picatrix, which in Iberia in the 17th century doesn't mean much, because Picatrix is just the name that you might give to any astral magic book. I have found myself one such Picatrix in the Inquisition of Cuenca. It's actually if my last interview with Erzbet, I was in Cuenca studying this book. And indeed, it's a small astral magic book. Among its content is treasure finding. So Was he using the Book of St. Cyprian to find treasure or this other Picatrix, whatever this other Picatrix might have been? We don't know. We just know that he had these two books and he was finding treasure somehow using these books.
So the earliest attestations of the books of Saint Cyprian are either medical or treasure hunting.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Medical, but look, when you say medicine in the early modern period, it's medicine isn't a sphere separated from religion or from magic. It's folk
exactly,
medicine is completely undistinguishable from folk religion or from folk anything. It's a continuum of things. So yeah, medical preoccupations, but the causes of if somebody had a physical ailment, the cause of which was determined to be supernatural. So you would use supernatural means and call it medicine.
Okay, so we have, as we just said, we have the medical side of things, but we also have the treasure hunting. But at what point do these books of Saint Cyprian develop this forbidden quality? Because medicine doesn't come across as being something that you would say, oh, that's evil, don't touch that. Treasure hunting, I can see some, because there's a lot of spirit conjuration, things like that being involved with it. But at what point do you think, in your best opinion, that where we see the books of Saint Cyprian develop this, as you said before, like your grandmother would scold you if you mentioned it. At what point in Iberian culture does it sort of accrete that notion around it?
There are a few points I can mention, although I have a hard time ascribing the totality the totality of the explanation to them. Look, we're talking about medicine, sure, but the fundamental point of a book of Saint Cyprian in this time would be the Prayer of Saint Cyprian, which was one of the very first magic prayers to be listed in an index of forbidden books in Portugal. So from a theological, ecclesiastic perspective, anytime the Prayer of St. Cyprian shows up, you're talking about something that's prohibited, and by association, a prohibited book, independently of whether people were using it to conjure spirits or not. If the prayer is prohibited, it's any other argumentation you can make around what the prayer is being used is null. It's prohibited. It's a blank statement. It's out. Now, maybe throughout the years, a few centuries of church condemnation, maybe it just stuck to your general church-going folk. That
Yeah, that
hearing
makes
about the
sense.
Prayer of St. Cyprian, they would acquire this natural fear of it. Now, obviously, it is a magic book, even though as a folk magic book, it sits in an ambiguous position, but it's still a magic book, and magic was always vilified by authorities. But look, how it acquires this supernatural fear as a cursed object, I genuinely can't say. I don't know. I just know the earliest mention to this I have is late 18th century, when some individuals. This isn't the case. It's a denunciation. Doesn't have a follow up. Some individuals mentioned that they were walking around, going somewhere in the middle of the night, and then they heard a familiar voice, which is a local priest, and that they were peeking behind some bushes, and that they saw a priest performing what appears to be a treasure hunting ritual. And they said that they heard the name of St. Cyprian and got scared and ran away. So there seems to be in the 18th century already an association between specifically St. Cyprian or books of St. Cyprian and something that should be feared. How that got formalized or constructed, it's a bit of a guessing job.
It's a mystery. Still really interesting to think about though. So regarding the actual prayer itself, there's so many different renditions of it that have survived throughout the centuries. But what was it that specifically made it prohibited by the church? I mean, maybe a lot of people who are familiar with Saint Cyprian who are listening to the show will already understand this, but for the benefit of people who maybe don't understand the full historical context of well, I say who Cyprian was, but I mean, Cyprian arguably wasn't ever a real man to begin with. But what could you elaborate further on that point?
Well, the prayer of Saint Cyprian has a few red flags that would make it suspicious from a theological or orthodox perspective. The first is that it's not a petitional prayer. It's not something that you say or that you utter, asking a saint to intercede in your behalf, as is a regular Christian prayer. You are supposed to assume a position of authority when you are saying this prayer. You are speaking as if you are Saint Cyprian. Look, that is immediately a break in what would be considered regular prayers. Makes it a suspicious text. Then you have the mention, like I said, to specific days that you're supposed to say a prayer, which equally make it suspicious because, from a theological perspective, how is it that a prayer, if it is real and you are talking to a saint, which is a real person, even if dead, how is it that it won't work on a day, but it will work on another day? This doesn't make sense. So this falls into the category of superstition, which is an error of faith. So you are doing something that doesn't make sense. And because we shouldn't look at Inquisition denunciations and condemnations as being illogical. There is a logic to it. There is actually a reasoning. So if this point of there is a prayer and you can only do it on certain days, this doesn't make sense. Even according to contemporary scientific method, science needs to be valid in every situation. It's not just on particular circumstances. So the same thing here. Why won't this work any other day? So when you have specific times, usually that's another red flag. And then it's an exorcism prayer, clearly, which in theory every Christian has the capacity to exercise, but this is usually in the Catholic context reserved for a specialized priest, because one of the great fears of Rome and Church in general is the incorrect performance of rites and sacraments. It's not that you can't do them, but there is no guarantee that you will do them correctly. If you do them incorrectly, you will incur in superstition, which is a specific type of religious crime, although not very serious. So to just prevent people from falling into religious error, best just get rid of these full type of exorcism things.
So it's just too close to being magic.
Yeah, it sits in an ambiguous position, an ambiguous territory, where very easily things might fall into magic or might fall into irreligiosity, and so might as well just banish it in case of so that it doesn't even go there.
You mentioned before the Moors, and maybe for our audience who are only familiar with the Moors from Shakespeare's Othello, who were these people and why did they have such a cultural importance to the people of the region?
Yeah, well, that's when we talk about Moors or Moros, there are two distinct things that we are saying when saying the single word. One is historical series of events and historical people. The other one is a mythical series of events and a mythical people. So when we're talking about Moors, this is a blanket term that's used in Iberia and in other regions throughout Europe. People would use this to refer to individuals of either North African origin or even you do have sub-Saharan Africans sometimes being referred to as Moors. It's a term that is usually associated with people of darker skin tone or who are Muslim in some capacity, or come from a Muslim land. You sometimes you might even have Christians that just happen to live in North Africa will be referred to as Moors. And 8th century Iberia, there was a large invading force that came into that territory. and very quickly took over the Iberian Peninsula due to a number of internal political circumstances that no point going into right now. But anyway, what ended up happening was that from the 8th century until the 11th or 12th century, a large portion of the Iberian Peninsula was under political or administrative rule of Muslim individuals from North Africa. Most of them from Berber origin, a few of them genuinely Arabic, the high leadership, but the general population was just North African Berbers. And these are the historical Moors. So this group of political individuals who governed the Iberian Peninsula for a period. Then, as the medieval period progressed, you had a movement in Iberia which retrospectively is called the Reconquista or the Reconquest, which is that there were a few Christian enclaves in northern Iberia. And gradually they started a campaign of reconquest of the territory that had been lost in the 8th century. And we should notice that both the Muslim occupation and the reconquest, it wasn't, people have a very romantic idea sometimes of what war in the medieval period was. This wasn't like a genocide or when the Iberian Peninsula was conquered by Muslim forces, the population remained the same. New people might be added, like a few Muslim villages might have been created, but overall the population was the same as in Visigothic Iberia, just Arian Christians. The same thing happening with the Conquista, that they weren't just banishing people from their territories, because otherwise who would plant and who would pay taxes? So it's just a gradual moving out battle between administrative powers to gain dominion over the territories. Now, after this historical movement happens, it's when you have the Kingdom of Portugal is founded in this period. Leon, Castile, Aragon, Navarra. Then they start going together, and then you end up just Portugal and Castile and Aragon. After this movement finishes, you would have groups of population who were the descendants of North African Berbers who just stayed around. These would be referred to as the Moriscos, which then in the 17th century there was a big drama in Castile particularly, and they ended up banishing them, which is it's a history in itself. No point going there. And this guy I talked about, Juan de Toledo, early 17th century, was one such Morisco. So a descendant of these 8th century guys who just came in. But then, this is the historical thing, as we know. But then you have the mythical narratives. And as a result of the conquista and the foundation of all these new Christian kingdoms, probably spontaneously, this type of stuff that happens, the local populations would start to construct their own narratives of the foundation of their territories and their villages and their cities and their own kingdoms. And so they created this mythical figure of the Moor. And basically a Moor or a Moro in this type of more folkish concept is a radically ancient ancestor. And not in the sense that we are currently descendants of them, but it's like a remote people that once lived here. In the sense that every single strange rock formation or every ruin, be it Roman or genuinely Moorish or Visigothic, that local people, they don't have a good historical memory of when that ruin was built. They will just say, well, that was the Moors. That's just Moor stuff. And then we also have associated with that the notion of the Moro Encantado, or the enchanted Moor, which fills the function in many Iberian regions of a fairy. Moros Encantados or Mouras Encantadas are said to inhabit these ruins, and given certain circumstances will manifest in some magical, mystical way. And as they were the rulers of the Iberian Peninsula before this current order of Christianity, they obviously will have knowledge or are themselves guarding the old treasures of the Moors who used to live here. So these are usually also the typical treasure guardian that you have both in Iberian folk tales and when you then go into magic books, such as books of St. Cyprian, these would be the spirits or the entities that you would have to conjure up or banish in order to access a buried treasure, which is assumed to be from Moorish times, meaning
Mm.
from a time where nobody remembers where it came from.
And would they be considered like a genus loci, the spirit of a location specifically, or could they have maybe more necromantic associations or nature spirit associations?
You could have both because there isn't one single Moorish corpus, let's say. Folk culture is always complicated, and you have various conceptions of what a Moor actually is. You do have them as ghosts of previous inhabitants of Iberia. You do have them as genuine genius loci, just a spirit of that place. But you also have a very specific type of narrative around them, which is a bit unique when compared to other treasure guardians, which is again the enchanted Moor, because this has a meaning, which is that and the narratives around these are particular too, because it's the notion that as the Reconquista was happening, that certain Moorish rulers and sorcerers, expecting to eventually return to reclaim Iberia, would have buried their riches in the earth, and that they would have enchanted somebody, usually a woman, to act as treasure guardian. Meaning that this isn't really a ghost or a spirit. This person is not dead. They are just enchanted, like in this suspended type of animation that in specific circumstances, should somebody try to dig for the treasure, should somebody try to do something with the treasure, this will manifest, but not in any other circumstance. And there are also particular times of the year where they manifest more often. This all depends on which story you're following. But yeah, you have all these this broad range, this spectrum of what a Mora can be. Sure, can be a ghost. Sure, can be a genius loci. And there's something in between, which is she is something that is neither dead nor alive. It might manifest, and that if you want to hunt that treasure, you have to force a manifestation in order to banish it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Al and Brian, you were in your previous book when you were on the show last. We were talking about the is it the Stammgeist?
Yes, the which, in as far as I can tell, in most cases, is regarded as most likely the owner of the buried treasure in those cases. But yes, it's the spirit, the ghost that hangs around the location where the gold was buried.
Mm. So it's just really interesting seeing across cultures we have very similar concepts at play regarding the guardians of treasures. Yeah, it's really interesting. So Jose, how important then are the inquisitorial records in like understanding the evolution of these Cyprianic texts?
Well, they're important in the sense that, as far as I know, they're the only leads we have.
They're the only possible way. I mean, for instance, I know that the Inquisition hoarded many of these documents or like held on to them, but there's very little other library evidence in libraries or personal collections. It's predominantly the inquisitorial record in which these documents survive.
Well, that's a very good question actually, because look, the all the books Saint Cyprian I found, which weren't that many. There's one I found in Coimbra. There's the one that we're publishing now. None of these books were found in an Inquisition record. These were found in old libraries, in old catalogs, because the Inquisition, particularly the Portuguese Inquisition, was very thorough and it tended to burn most of the forbidden literature that it found.
I see, right.
But what we do have is that they were also great at keeping records. So the very few books we do find, we find them in libraries. But if we want to understand the concept of them, what was happening in terms of magic practice around the time they were being produced, then our recourse is going to the Inquisition and try to find trials that were happening in those days and try to piece together an image of the context of where that book would have shown up. So you need to work with both these types of archives. But look, if you only had the manuscript in a library, you have the manuscript, which is valuable in itself. But the manuscript itself doesn't tell you anything about itself. It just exists. It tells you about its content, but you don't know what it is from a
Historical
broad.
perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we want to have an actual understanding, a historical and academic understanding of these books, the Inquisition is, at this point, to the best of my knowledge, the only recourse we have.
And what's the kind of data that you find in those records?
Inquisition?
Yeah, yeah. So you mentioned trials. So is it like lists of crimes and lists of offenses, punishment details, the contents? Like, is it like a précis of the content of the book, or like what kind of information do you find?
Inquisitorial documentation is formulaic from an inquisitor's perspective, but then what you get will depend a lot on the defendant, and also at a certain point of how smart the inquisitor is. What you have, first of all, an inquisition trial usually opens with a denunciation. Somebody walks in to the inquisition and says, I saw somebody do these things. And what sometimes happens in those cases is they will say, I saw a man, he had this book, seems to be a magic book, and it contained these elements. And then he will give his memory of what the book contains, and that's something we can work with. Then, if this guy is arrested, then throughout the trial process, he's constantly questioned. Occasionally, they will try to ascertain what the book contains if the book is unfamiliar to the inquisitor. Because if it's a familiar book, if it's like a Key of Solomon, the inquisitor actually doesn't need to bother with the content of the book because it's already forbidden by the index. So he doesn't need to concern himself with the content. He already has a crime. If the book is unfamiliar, such as a book of Saint Cyprian, they aren't indexed, although the prayer of Saint Cyprian is. He will try to question as much as he can the person involved to try to ascertain the content of the book. And if the guy is cooperant, then you will have a description of the content of the book by his memory. And then, short of finding a magic book, the second best thing you can find is something called an inquisitorial qualification. Should the book have been caught and apprehended by the Inquisition, it is typically sent for analysis by a specialized theologian. And the point he will produce a document called a qualification. And the point of the qualification is to prove that the book is heretical. So in these documents, you will find frequently full descriptions of the content. The qualifier will go, so I have this book with me. This is the content. It has a section on this, on this, on this, on this. And then he has to justify how everything is a crime. And these types of documents, these are the best, short of, again, finding a book, because they will occasionally make block quotes from the book that will allow you just an insight into the content and maybe try to relate it with other forms of literature. And some qualifiers are extremely detailed, and they will pretty much give you the whole book if you know how to put it together. So it's this type of, it's never a sure thing that you'll find what you want when you find an Inquisition trial focusing on a magic book. But it's this type of thing that you have to look for. Look for the denunciations, look for the questionings, see if there's a qualification, and try to piece together what this whole story is. It's not a linear process. It's something that needs active imagination sometimes.
Yeah, it sounds grueling. In your previous episode with Elizabeth, you went into quite a lot of detail about how you go about doing this process of researching and discovering these texts, but for our audience, how did you specifically discover this manuscript 174, number 155? And why did you immediately think when you discovered it that it was of particular importance?
Yeah. Well, this goes back to the very first days when I was working on books of Saint Cyprian, when I was trying to figure out the contemporary version of the book that you can buy in a store. I was trying to understand it from a historical perspective. So one of the original sources I found that I could derive some information from was an old paper by this ethnographer from 1888, which was one of the first semi-academic attempts to describe books of Saint Cyprian. It's a very valuable paper, although the guy is, he's very far removed from our preoccupations of methodological agnosticism or impartiality. So he's quite he condemns the books quite vehemently. But the paper was interesting because not only did it give ample information on printed books of Saint Cyprian in the 19th century, at a certain point, this guy, called Adolfo Coelho, he mentions something that is, at that time, like inconceivable. He mentions that he knew this other guy called Antonio da Silva Túlio, he worked at the Portuguese National Library. And Adolfo Coelho mentions that Antonio da Silva Túlio had a book of Saint Cyprian, which he refers to as a genuine book of Saint Cyprian, which is a very ambiguous thing to say, because what is a genuine book of Saint Cyprian if Saint Cyprian never existed? And he copied a passage from that book. It's in his paper, and it's in extremely broken Latin. It's very complicated, and he describes this supposedly genuine book of Saint Cyprian in some capacity. He doesn't go into much detail. He says some of the things that were contained in there, says it was heavily damaged, and that's it. Then he says, well, unfortunately, my friend Antonio da Silva Túlio died, and so I lost track of this book, and I couldn't do a dedicated study on it. And this was in 1888. There was this mysterious passage of this mysterious book that he mentions, was called Cypriani Magici Septenora Magica. I knew that this reference existed from the 19th century, and I probably mentioned it in every single major Saint Cyprian publication I've published, because it's a data point that we have in the 19th century of when these books were being put to print. But I'll be honest, I would quote it and then move on with my life as if that quote didn't exist, because the quote was so strange, the passage that he copied was so different from everything I knew about books of Saint Cyprian. It didn't fit the narrative of the story I knew that so far about books of Saint Cyprian. And I tried to find this supposed manuscript a number of times, because I did have a title and I did have the name of a previous owner, which is a lot when you know how to work with archives. And it was lost to time. Somehow I knew it existed, but probably best for me to just ignore that it existed, because it would really spoil my historical research and what I thought a book of Saint Cyprian was. And this was the situation for a long time, until one day I was doing my PhD in history. It was like 2021. It was the libraries had not been open that far, not that long after the COVID shutdown. So I was trying to make up for lost time, going to a bunch of libraries in the shortest amount of time possible. And eventually, I decided to do an exploratory research of the Portuguese National Library, the manuscript section. Meaning, not use the digital catalog, but go through every single entry one by one, those old school tiny little papers with the numbers and the references and the titles. And it was there that I very unexpectedly, one day, 2021, after having searched for this book for a very long time and then decided to forget about it because maybe somebody, maybe it was a collective delusion, I don't know. One day I found a piece of paper saying Magicia Septenora Magicae, author Saint Cyprian. Now I immediately knew what this was. A bit of a shock because, again, I had the reference from 1888, but I wasn't actually expecting this to actually mean it. Like, I wasn't expecting this to produce anything. It was just this odd thing that we would tell each other in the future that something crazy was written back then. So I wasn't expecting to find that book, but I found it unexpectedly. And then I asked to see it. And the library staff was very comprehensive. They were good people, and I was there a lot, so they kind of knew my face. And they brought in a small little book, very heavily damaged, that indeed had the exact same characteristics as Adolfo Coelho had mentioned in 1888. So the book that he described in his original paper, belonging to Antonio da Silva Túlio, turns out was real. Turns out it wasn't actually missing. It was at the National Library, but nobody ever bothered checking the little notebook, the little notes, the little cards. Because as it turns out, I then managed to speak with the director of the manuscript section. The digital catalog and the central catalogs, they have plenty of mistakes, and they sometimes miss things. And this was the case. It wasn't lost. It was just missing for 140 years. So I found this book, and obviously, as a historian that I have become in the meantime, if I did find this book, independently of how uncomfortable this book makes me, of how much it spoils my narrative of the books of St. Cyprian, it is my obligation to do my best to make this available and contextualize this and prevent future scholars from being confused by it. So that's what I did with Brian's help.
Well, why do you say that it spoiled your preconceived notion of what a Cyprian book should be?
For various reasons. First of all, like I said, books of St. Cyprian in the 17th century tend to be folk in origin. It's a folk type of literature, a collection of folk prayers or procedures, and this really breaks with that because, first of all, it's not in vernacular, which is something that I knew that the Portuguese books of St. Cyprian were consistently written in vernacular, even though they are clearly meant for priestly use. So it was not written in vernacular. And it's a stretch to say that it was written in Latin. And Brian can probably talk to that.
Yeah, we'll get to that soon. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a stretch saying that it's written in Latin. It's a really weird one. Then it contained elements which were clearly identifiable as influenced by French and Italian grimoire. Like I said, particularly, even though there is no common section between that book and the book we call the Grand Grimoire, there are clear mentions to the Grand Grimoire in that book. And for the longest time, I thought that influence from the Grand Grimoire, while detectable in Iberian Cyprian books, was mostly restricted to Spain. You do have books of St. Cyprian in Spain, contemporarily printed still, that contain large sections from the Grand Grimoire. And I always assumed, okay, this is a Spanish characteristic of the books that they produce there, because they obviously have a greater proximity to France. So it's a lot easier for this material to be integrated there. We don't get this in Portugal. Turns out, yeah, we do. So this kind of spoils this clear distinction I was making between Portuguese and Spanish books. Not that it offended me, it was just cool. So it turns out it's a lot more messier than that.
Yeah, that seems to be the general rule when we're studying the grimoires. It's a lot messier than we initially thought. Yeah.
And then there's also a notion of the Cyprian books, for all their bad name, for all their fame as terrible, horrible things. If you read the content, it's not that bad. It's still a book that fits itself into a Christian narrative.
Mm.
In a way or another, not Orthodox Christian. And this book was exactly the opposite, in that it's an anti. I would go as far as calling it an anti-Christian book. It's anti-Christian in the perspective that the Christian would call it anti-Christian,
Or
meaning that it exists.
diabolic, or
Yeah, it exists within a Christian framework, but it's really subversive to Christian ideology or however theology, however you want to call it. So it's really diabolical in nature. And it's noticeable that the very title kind of indicates that. It's not a book of Saint Cyprian, it's a book of Cyprian the Magician.
Mm.
So this might be me projecting, but this seems to suggest something, that you have the story of Cyprian the Magician that converts to Christianity, and then you have the books of Saint Cyprian as this Christian character. This seems to be the non-Christian incarnation of that character, Cyprian the Magician.
Yeah, which readers of Jake Stratton Kent will be very familiar with.
Yeah.
Thank you for explaining that. And I think we might circle back to questions and ideas about the French diabolic influences of the Grand Grimoire, etc. But first, I want to get to Brian. I feel like we've neglected you quite significantly so far in the interview, so I do want to talk to you a little bit. So, Brian, when when José came to you and asked you to translate this text, what were your initial thoughts and feelings about what you were handed?
Well, yeah. It both physically and in terms of its content, the book was and still is really unlike anything I've seen before. Uh, the first thing we should probably note, we've been calling it a manuscript. It's really not technically a manuscript. It's not handwritten. It's a printed booklet, either a one-off or one of a very small print run that has not otherwise survived. Um, and it looks like it was produced by someone who probably only had a rudimentary understanding of how to use a printing press. Um, as readers will be able to see from the facsimile images included in José's book, it's the 7 hours is not only very haphazardly printed. The capitalization is almost random. There are these meaningless strings of letters that I think were just accidentally left on the printing matrix. Um, and the text is just generally very smudged and blurry and difficult to read. But the booklet itself, as José said, is severely damaged. There's a large hole near the top of every single page where it seems like the book was just like punctured all the way through by something.
And I
Um,
should mention really quick for our listeners, if you are to get if you buy the book, the full facsimile of the of like not the manuscript, but the actual text itself is within the book, so you can actually see this damage firsthand yourself.
yeah, and the due to the way that this thing was printed, there's a relatively small amount of text on each page. So this huge gaping hole resulted in pretty frequent gaps within the text, which makes putting together a translation really difficult because with Latin, there can be a lot of ambiguity when in how certain words are interpreted when the other parts of a sentence with which they're like grammatically correlated are missing. Um, so that was one obstacle. Um, then there's as Jose said, there's the fact that the Latin in which it's written it's full of phonetic spellings, like it uses the letter A for E, Z for S, D for T, N for M. Sometimes throws in additional letters, which I'm guessing probably was the author attempting to match his own like vernacular pronunciation. Um, and not to mention just simple misspellings and either absent or highly irregular punctuation, big gaps, not like missing text, but just like the words are printed on opposite sides of the page for no apparent reason. Um, and all of this just introduces an additional layer of confusion in establishing what the untranslated text is even meant to be in the first place.
Yeah, it sounds like a
Um,
nightmare trying to work through all this.
it took some time, but yeah, with a lot of frustrated squinting at the computer screen and a lot of kind of just pouring through dictionaries uh, to make some educated guesses as to what some of these words were meant to be. I was able to come up with something that I feel is at least plausibly correct. Though, like, there are definitely still passages where I'm not entirely confident I have the right meaning. Um, and also this it was more than 4 years ago that I worked on this, and I have no doubt that if I were doing this again today from scratch, I would at least render some things differently. But that's kind of just in the nature of translation. There is a certain amount of interpretive art. It's not just a mechanical process, you know.
Mm.
Um,
So say for the massive challenge of trying to put all these jigsaw pieces together, was there anything in the actual text itself that sort of leapt out at you as unique?
yeah, like I mean, I'm certainly not the expert in the either the Cyprianic material or the Iberian uh Grimoire material more generally that José is. But it was interesting for me to come across a number of allusions to concepts derived from Iberian folklore, just mentioned in passing in the text without any real explanation, because of course the intended audience would just intuitively understand what was being spoken about. Um, I will note one example, just from my own background as a one-time professional archaeologist. I did like the way the book instructs the reader to look for buried treasure where Moorish olive trees are growing, and this is because finding non-native trees planted somewhere is often a sign of previous human habitation. So it can be used to identify an archaeological site, even where there are no artificial structures remaining above ground. So that's actually pretty sound advice if you're looking for ancient burials.
Yeah, burials of treasure. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's really cool. So yeah, so like as I've mentioned already, Brian and I have discussed the nature of treasure hunting magic in the Faustian tradition with Dr. Al Cummings, and their book, The Black Raven. Um, but Jose, what can you tell us about the the way in which treasure hunting magic was done in the Iberian tradition, or to what degree is it an important aspect of the Iberian tradition?
Um, well, I would say it makes up an important part of the tradition because of the historical and cultural context I mentioned earlier. This 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 kind of substrate of folk narratives about previous inhabitants of Iberia that are omnipresent, be it in Portugal or Spain. It's every village has a number of stories about these ancient Moors
Mm.
that some of them might be hiding somewhere. And I there's that aspect, which is obviously very significant. And then there is this other one, which isn't, I cannot claim Iberian specificity to it, which is the more abundant mentions to magic practice that I find in the Inquisition tend to be from the 18th century. We do have previous mentions. I wrote a whole thesis on those previous mentions. But the 18th century is when the density increases. And it's almost exact to the year when you step into the 18th century, there's an immediate explosion of treasure hunting magic. Now, 18th century and treasure hunting is the treasure hunting in the 18th century is the popularity grows all over Europe. So this isn't a specifically Iberian thing. If you read, for example, Owen Davis, he also notices that there is a great deal more of treasure hunting in the 18th century. I think Dillinger also mentions this. And but what seems to be the case in Iberia is, since we did have this pre-existing cultural aspect of the enchanted moors and the buried treasures and the ruins, that this really kind of sticks, this kind of glues together, and it becomes it's the sum of the parts is greater than the two are. So it kind of flourishes into something very specific here because it bonded so well with local culture. I assume this is how it becomes so relevant. And then again, I can only speak of the books that I know. Every single manuscript I found from in Portugal from the 18th century and after the 18th century, they are all treasure hunting books. Previous to the 18th century, I have found these in Cuenca, these some astral magic books. 18th century, the first Cyprian book I found entirely dedicated to treasure hunting. This one entirely dedicated to treasure hunting, and I also found another book, which isn't a Cyprian book, but again entirely dedicated to treasure hunting. So this seems to become the center of magic practice or magic literature produced in Iberia during this time.
Mm. It's really interesting how the more that we're learning about this region of history, the more we're redefining what the grimoires were aimed towards. And we've since the 19th century, 20th century, 21st, early 21st century, the idea of a grimoire was always like, Ars Goetia, you have all these spirits that you're conjuring from a circle, and it's all very high ceremonial. But the more grimoires that we start to translate, and the more we're looking at, like, specifically in the folk magic perspective, we're finding more and more it's just people going out into the woods looking for buried treasure and dealing with ghosts. So it's just a really fascinating development for us to really come to understand where our tradition, or where this tradition is coming from, and yeah, casting more light into that aspect
Yeah,
of things.
and you can understand that from a social perspective, if you simply remember that the main preoccupation of folk magic, it's just a handful of them. It's physical protection, health, and financial well-being. Now, you have books that will try to tackle financial well-being by trying to guarantee a good crop, trying to guarantee the health of your animals, trying to win the lottery even. But you can look at treasure hunting as simply an expression of that. It's people just trying to find the means of sustenance. By engaging with these books with a particular aspect of their own culture, it doesn't seem all that fantastical to them. The fact that treasures will be buried in a place with ruins, if they have stories throughout their territories claiming that such treasures exist, then this form of magic really isn't extraordinary. It's just a natural continuation of what you already have in that location.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's wonderful. And to on the flip side as well, maybe you find, like, centered around universities, you tend to find more documents like the Ars Notoria, which are like predominantly like memorization and study sort of grimoires. So yeah, culturally specific location and class. Like the priestly class would have had maybe slightly different styles compared to the common folk. But yeah, it's really interesting material. Going a little more specific to some of the content of the book, you mentioned one, Antonio Redondo and his troop of treasure hunters. So for our audience, could you describe a little bit about their misadventures?
So this is a story I relate in the introduction to the Septimora Magica, because, like I said, this book shows up, and I can't deny it anymore, and it needs to be dealt with. So if we have a book here that is a book of St. Cyprian, or at least Cyprian the Mage. And it somehow relates to the Grand Grimoire because it mentions by name Lucifus Hofocali, a spirit specific and very much associated with the Grand Grimoire. So how do we justify, how do we understand or propose an understanding of what is this spirit name doing in this grimoire, in this apparently remote region of Europe? And fortunately, very shortly after finishing my PhD, I had managed to find a set of Inquisition trials centered around this individual, Antonio Redondo. So this story is a story of a treasure hunting group. Like many other treasure hunting groups, you have several stories of individuals such as these. Some of them would be professional, some of them wouldn't. They're very fluid, these treasure hunting troops. And this story was very particular in that there was close to the border with Spain, around the region of the other side of Spain is the region of Salamanca. It's Campucharo. There was a treasure hunting group active in that side on the Portuguese side of the border, and at a certain point they attract to their group this guy that you mentioned, Redondo. Now they attract him. They basically kind of offer him a job in the group, but they kept talking about hunting treasure with a book of St. Cyprian, and that should somebody agree to make a pact with this book of St. Cyprian, that for sure they would be able to find treasure. And the point of them contacting this individual was basically to press him into being the one to perform the pact. So they were basically trying to find a sacrificial lamb. They apparently had a book that required the pact to function. They call it the Book of St. Cyprian, but they needed somebody to make the pact, so they were trying to get this guy to do it. Eventually, he does agree to it. We cannot dismiss how much the weight of poverty and the weight of hunger. These stories of individuals being pressed to perform pacts are actually kind of common in the Portuguese North. Folk tales of individuals wanting to find treasure and finding somebody that's just poor and miserable and offer him some money in exchange for a pact. And people frequently say yes, because you need to eat right now. Worry about your salvation later.
Yeah, that's really intense.
So he agrees to this, and eventually he meets a guy that was a part of this group. It's uncertain if he was either Italian or French. Vicente Murrigoni, they call him, and there's a few different spellings to his name because the inquisitors were just taking notes of what people were saying, so sometimes you get variations of spellings. And this guy had this book, which they refer constantly as a book of St. Cyprian. However, they do mention during the trial proceedings, when the inquisitors are asking about this book, what did it contain? People do offer block quotes from it, sections that they remembered from the book, or things that they saw being done with recourse to that book. And the interesting part is that everything that they mention about this supposed book of St. Cyprian is entirely consistent with the Grand Grimoire. The spirit name, the procedure that they needed the bloodstone to do a circle and the hazel rod to threaten the spirit involved. So it seemed that in some strange way that this guy, Vicente Murrigoni, had in his possession a Grand Grimoire, but that somehow individuals in the 18th century were referring to this as a book of St. Cyprian.
So we see that cross-fertilization occurring, right?
Exactly.
Cross-pollination, right?
I was very fortunate to have found those trials when I did, because it was around after I finished my PhD. Then, okay, Brian finished that translation 4 years ago. Time to get this thing done finally. And so by the time I got to work on this book, I already had this information present. That turns out it wasn't just the Spanish versions of the Book of St. Cyprian that were cross-pollinating with the Grand Grimoire. We do have evidence of Grand Grimoire material being either interpreted or being mixed or being called something of St. Cyprian in Portugal. And this allows for, it doesn't explain, because if we are not there to record history as it happens, we only have these small points, but it does offer some kind of context or some kind of understanding that the showing up of this spirit name in the apparently 19th century weird print Book of St. Cyprian, there is something, it's not outlandish. There is a reasonable explanation. We can imagine a reasonable explanation for this spirit name to be there, which, it's not saying a lot, but it's saying a lot.
And
So
it is
that's
probably. Oh, sorry, you carry on.
No, that's the value of that trial. It's a clear black and white reference to Grand Grimoire material functioning as a Cyprian book in 18th century Portugal, which takes a great weight off my back in terms of explaining how this book might come to be.
I absolutely love that this is pact magic as well, that's been cross-fertilized into it, and the spirit as well, Lucifuge Rofocale, the one who flees the light, right? We see him show up, like you said, throughout the Grand Grimoire versions of the Grand Grimoire, and it's really interesting. Like, there's no other spirits listed in this text from the Grand Grimoire. Is it only this one?
If Brian's transition is
I,
correct, and my interpretation is,
yeah, I believe that's the only spirit named in the text
yeah,
that I can recall.
Yeah, and it gives this really sort of similar quality to say, what's the name of it now? The Science of Negromancy. That's it. Which Dr. Al Cummings put a course out on recently, and that's a grimoire with a singular leading spirit. In that case, it's Asmodee as the ruler over all spirits. So you have this one spirit. In our case, it's Lucifuge Rofocale as the primary intermediary at the heart of, or at the very top of, the hierarchy. And then the methodology of the grimoire gives you a description for the manner in which you approach any spirit of the air, of the land, of the subterranean, of treasure. And then adding the idea of pact magic on top of that as well. I just think it's really interesting to consider, like, the way in which these techniques transmit. And is it Jake? Yeah, I think Jake Stratton-Kent also goes over another Iberian grimoire in his Cyprian the Mage, where Beelzebub is the only chief listed, and Lucifuge is the main intermediary of that as well. And there's so many variations. It's really quite wonderful, and I'm so interested in how these techniques flow through the grimoire corpus. I just find it infinitely fascinating. But yeah, Jose, you also mention in your book that there's another grimoire, a Spanish text called The Secrets of Hell. So to what degree then does that book have an influence on this story?
Well, it's that book in particular, Secretos del Infierno, the Secrets of Hell. That is an early 19th century book, a Spanish book, which again is one of these examples that I was familiar with, which is simply a Grand Grimoire, full Grand Grimoire, being translated into Spanish, and being spread out as a Book of St. Cyprian, or a book of local treasure hunting, even though it's not called Book of St. Cyprian, it's called the Secrets of Hell. But this is a thing that happens frequently in Spain, of full Grand Grimoires being brought into that territory, being either calling themselves Books of St. Cyprian or inserting themselves into contexts. This is a more normalized type of phenomenon that happens in Spain that I was unexpecting to find in Portugal until I found it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we see the same thing happen in Germany and Great Britain. We see the same sort of like you said, being inserted into context. Cultural context is key, and the myths of the land and of the people are really important. So yeah, so becoming Cyprianic as it
Mhm.
travels is really interesting. This has all been really cool talking about like the context and the background and the story and everything. Let's talk about the actual book and like the contents of the book, because there is as far as I'm aware anyway, the description of the talisman in this text is really it's wild. I suppose is the best way of describing it. So for our listeners, could either of you, could both of you chip in and talk about like how is this talisman constructed? What is it?
You want to go, Brian?
Uh, yeah. So my interpretation of it is that it's essentially a very elaborate treasure dowsing device. It's built out of several types of wood and a number of different animal parts. Though the text doesn't make precisely clear how it operates. Um, the directions for constructing it, uh, it describes a set of seven 50 by 50-inch square wooden frames that are mounted equidistantly on a 47-inch wooden post so that they can rotate on it like wheels on an axle. And each one of these is inscribed with the names of the seven classical planets. And the text seems to suggest that their motion, the motion of the wheels, will indicate both the presence of buried treasure and which planetary hour it was buried under, which is the basis for a disenchanting procedure that comes later. The text, as I've translated it, it says the wheel, and there's a gap, but the wheel is turned, and whenever it indicates that it has been moved over a treasure, the litany of that magical hour shall be recited. Uh, but it's not really clear, at least to me, how the hour is indicated because it says each wheel has all of the planets' names on it. Now, I think the text may be corrupted here, and that it's rather that each of the seven wheels is meant to have one planetary name on it, perhaps. But that's just a guess on my part what it might actually be talking about.
So it's huge, right? This is a massive quote unquote talisman, this
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
object.
and
like 4 feet tall.
Yeah.
it's
Um,
important to note that it's the central um, method by which you're actually supposed to find treasure. The text describes other things that you're supposed to do, but this is the central element of how you will find treasure by doing this thing. So it's not just a small mention. It's a central part of the whole ritual that the book describes. So it's something that you can't avoid.
mm, yeah, it makes up the big chunk of the book. Yeah. And it's quite gruesome as well. That like you mentioned there was animal components. It's often like parts of birds and cats that are strapped to various locations on the object. But what can you tell us about how the object is charged, how it is deployed?
Right. Well, as I mentioned, it talks about the wheels moving when this thing is moved over a place where there's buried treasure. It's like I say, like a divining rod almost. Um, and then it goes on to say that once this it's been indicated in this way, it says something to the effect of one shall cast the talismans down from on high or from above, and it will reveal the entrance, presumably the entrance to where this cave, subterranean cave, or just this uh, vacuum where the treasure is buried. Uh, and so I think possibly the idea is that when it indicates by its movement that treasure is nearby, you are simply allow it to kind of tip over, and it will land on the appropriate spot. Again, like a dowsing rod dipping down over water. Um, that's my interpretation of what you're supposed to actually do with it.
When I read it, I couldn't help but laugh because I had this visual of like someone climbing up to the top of a large like a tree or a big rock or something and then chucking the thing off to like discover which direction it was going in. But yeah, Jose, do you have anything that you would like to add about the actual talisman itself? Is there anything that you found particularly interesting about it?
Well, again, when we're talking about this text, a lot of it will fall into interpretation. Brian's interpretation, my interpretation, the reader eventual interpretation. So one of the other things that seems to be fundamental in the functioning of this talisman seems to be that it is entirely dependent. Its functioning, or let's say its rotation, all those things seems to be entirely dependent on you having performed a pact with Lucifuge beforehand.
Right.
Apparently that's the if you wanna fall into the inner narrative of the book, that you will need to have this pact, and apparently it's Lucifuge will be communicating with you in finding treasure through this talisman, through these
As
rotations.
a tutelary
Yeah,
guide or
yeah.
spirit in that sense.
So there is a planetary aspect to the talisman, clearly. This is explicit throughout the entire text, but it apparently won't work unless you have the aid of this treasure finding spirit, this
I see.
diabolical treasure finding spirit.
So one other thing that I found that was really interesting that I thought I really wanted to talk to you both about was part of the instruction tells us to deny the magic of Adam, Solomon, and David, etc., as well as deny the prior talismans are necessary for the work, and that only the hour of the rite is needed. Could you elaborate further on that?
Yeah, this is one of the passages that I'm skeptical of my own interpretation that I came up with, but just the combination of uh, absent punctuation and just seemingly incorrect Latin grammar, it makes it really difficult to pin down what it's trying to say here. There are a number, like there are at least three separate clauses in this sentence, and it's not perfectly clear if some of them are independent or dependent upon preceding clauses.
I see.
But the the rendering I come up with is I can read it here. It's I name trust in all that your magical hours hold and Lucifuge and the influx of the planets. I deny that your magical systems, Adam, Noah, Solomon, David, and the three kings, are truly magical, and magical talismans are necessary for my work. But again, it's for example, the part about the magical talismans being necessary. It's not clear if that's saying the reader is denying that, or if it's a separate clause stating, and these are necessary for my work. It's very confusingly written.
I see. I liked it as we mentioned before that this is specifically quite a diabolical text. And so this idea that during the ritual itself, the magician is denying the system of Adam, Solomon, and David seems to have this incredibly uh how do I put it, like transgressive nature to it, which might have been incredibly powerful to the operator in that moment doing it as an act, as like you mentioned before, like as a diabolical act or as an act of like anti-Christian for within a Christian perspective. So do you think that that might be a valid interpretation?
No, I would say so. It's one of the things I find most fascinating about this. And if even if I'm looking at it from outside of the perspective of somebody who's simply interested in Cyprian books, I do think that this aspect of the book is what makes it more interesting from global magic perspective. In that it's look, even if Keys of Solomon and Solomonic derived magic might be prohibited by the church, let's say, there is a clear structure to a clear hierarchy of powers when you are talking about Solomonic magic. And even the Grand Grimoire, which is mentioned as many as being a particularly diabolical magic book within the broader Solomonic tradition, places a number of check marks and a number of procedures to protect you from the spirits that you are summoning. This book does away with all of that. It deny as a, if it's related to the Grand Grimoire, and the Grand Grimoire is a late Solomonic type of magic, it's denying its own roots, let's say. It's denying it's a system derived from a Solomonic system, but it's denying the Solomonic procedure. So yeah, I would assume if somebody is familiar with Solomonic literature that this is quite a break, quite a breaking of taboo when it comes to Solomonic procedures. Sure. And again, this is the more interesting part to me, because Lucifuge and the Grand Grimoire have been, it's pretty well established what Lucifuge is, how you work with him. There is the pact that's done with Lucifuge has been reprinted many times, and this offers you a different type of pact. It's the same spirit. You're calling him for the same purpose as the Grand Grimoire, but let's do this in the opposite way. Let's not constrain the spirit. Let's not threaten him with the blasting rod. Let's not be rough with him. Let's make a direct pact with him. Let's do away with hierarchies of power, and it's me and him, and it's the planets. From a magical perspective, preternatural forces. It's me, it's this demon, and it's preternatural forces which are neither divine nor devilish. It's almost like a Faustian type of thing. You're almost making yourself a Faust in asking this spirit, this diabolical spirit, to understand these natural phenomena in order to find treasure.
It's
So that
wonderful.
that's the value I find there, which is a lot. I love that passage, the pact.
Yeah. It was, for me, it's the most standout part of the book that I was like, this is important. This bit is really important. I really like this. And then yes, finally, the pact itself is then wrapped around a rock and thrown into the sea. And I think that's really interesting as well, because you don't normally get a description of what to do with the pact. And there's a debate even today as to what to do with it. Some people say you should burn your pact and you should keep the ash, and some people say that you should actually keep the physical document itself and like wrap it within something or seal it away within a vessel of some kind. And so here we've given this really interesting like description to, well, we're wrapping it around in a rock, but we're getting rid of it. We're throwing it away, right? Or are we returning it to the ocean in some way? I'm not sure. How do you interpret that?
Well, there are a few interpretations that I can give to this. And again, these are personal interpretations because the text doesn't say much about it. Look, there are associations in Portuguese culture between the devil and the sea. There are particular festivities. Saint Bartholomew is one case that on the day of Saint Bartholomew you are supposed to go to the sea, and there is a duality in Portugal between Saint Bartholomew and the devil, because Saint Bartholomew is the keeper of the devil. On his feast day, the devil is let loose, and some say that he resides in the ocean during that day. So you go to the ocean to have these ritual baths.
I see. So there's definitely a local tradition based around
Yeah,
this. Okay, I
yeah,
wasn't familiar with that.
and yeah, and certain. I also read, because this is something I always found when it comes to Moro lore. I also read something Lovecraftian in it, although that's really projection by my part. I realize it.
Oh, I felt the whole Lovecraftian thing when we were talking about the Moors as these like ancient peoples from, this long forgotten distant past who left these magical objects within the earth. Yeah, it's very
Yeah,
Lovecraftian.
complete, and the connection to the sea and the ambiguous position the sea has in Portuguese culture, particularly in folk culture, which is, everybody loves the sea, but if you ask a fishing village what they think of the sea, they're terrified of it, even though they are dependent on it. So the sea is a very ambiguous type of thing. So I read some of that into it, that this is the recognition of the sure, the sea is where we derive our livelihoods, but this is where we go to die. The sea is constantly trying to kill us. So there is an inherent evilness in the sea, or at least a great danger.
Hmm.
This is where I read this going. Besides these specific, like Saint Bartholomew connotations and other types of sea saints, this relationship of of coastal communities and their ambiguity towards the sea, and equally the ambiguity of the devil in full Catholicism. I read the connection there, even though I'm right now finding it hard to collect the correct words to express this. But that's where this takes me.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating stuff. But then, yeah, finally, we have the Bible consecration, which I think is a really interesting aspect of the ritual itself. We fumigate a Bible as we're performing this, and then we have this very long list of psalms, and in place of where we would normally say the name of God, we are to replace this with the name of the hour in which we work. So could you could you speak about the nature of the specific psalms that are chosen, and why do you think they are done in this specific in the specific order as well in which they're given?
Well, I can't really speak to any interpretation as to why these particular psalms were chosen. I can kind of contextualize what this part of the operation is trying to do, I think. Earlier in the text, it states, quote, Moorish treasure is protected by magical art, sanctified to the planet ruling in the hour of the enchantment. Um, Now, and this seems to imply that the enchantment that is protecting the treasure is tied to the hour in which this enchantment is laid down. But then later in the text, just after the line we mentioned previously about casting down the talismans, it says, "quote At which point the litany of the hour shall be recited," which is referring to these litanies of psalms or verses of various psalms with the certain names and names of God replaced with the names of the planets. Uh, and it's again, I mentioned that this it seems kind of ambiguous. It would seem to be indicating that it's talking about the whatever the present hour is that you're performing this operation, unless, as I mentioned previously, the text describing the apparatus was somewhat incorrect, and that the hour of the original enchantment is actually indicated by the one of the wheels turning. Um, but in any case, the text then proceeds to provide this list of psalm verses, and also the in five out of the seven cases, five out of the seven planets, a set of unique kind of call and response prayer that corresponds to that planet, which this recital is intended to remove the enchantment. Now, I mentioned that five of the planets have these call and response prayers. It's the Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, and Jupiter. And what I found really interesting about these is that each one actually incorporates one of the lines of the Sator square. The Sator, Arepo, Tenet, opera rotus. But it uses it as an actual like translatable word in the text, except for arepo, which is not a Latin word. Um, so that I found that really kind of inexplicable but interesting.
Yeah, I must have missed that on my read through. I didn't notice the Sator Square information. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Yeah, Jose, do you have anything that you would add?
No, Brian pretty much covered it. I want to talk about the Sator Magic Square,
Yeah,
which
go for it.
is really odd. Look, it's again, it's odd that that's there. It's not something that you would find typically in a Solomonic text, from my memory at least. However, I do need to underline, and I didn't add this to the introduction, which I'm very proud of the introduction to that book, but I didn't add this there because didn't I don't know. Maybe I should have, but I don't look. The issue is that we do have instances in the Inquisition, a couple of pacts that the Inquisition caught and didn't burn, where the Sator Magic Square is used as a demonic signature. So you sign your name, and where supposedly is the devil's signature, or however you want to call it, somebody just draws the Sator Magic Square in there. So there is an implicit association between that square and spirit names. You even have one remarkable, beautiful um, talisman that is found 19th century already, early 19th century in Brazil, that the Inquisition caught, which has this very elaborate, beautiful drawing, and you have 5 figures that are named after the 5 words of the Sator Magic Square. So there is, in this context, again, an association between the Sator Magic Square and spirit names, that they can be treated as spirit names. If this, in the context of this book, is supposed to be the signature of Lucy Fouge, I cannot say, but it's something that exists, that has been noted historically,
Mm.
that the Sator Magic Square is associated with spirits.
The only grimoire I can think of where it might be in is the Abramelin, but I'm don't quote me on that. Don't quote me on
Sure.
that. But there are a lot of magic squares in the Abramelin. So yeah, yeah, that's really cool, really fascinating stuff. Um, I think though that we should bring this conversation to an end because I don't want to spoil every last bit of this entire really wonderful text. Um, it has been really fantastic talking to both of you, and I've really enjoyed this new exploration of treasure hunting, which is becoming really prevalent in the grimoire tradition. Um, and there's been tons of information as well that this book has presented, which I think is incredibly practical, despite the actual uh, the actual ritual itself as described being incredibly elaborate and very difficult to accomplish. There are sections of the text itself which really stood out to me and I really, really enjoyed and I think are worth exploring further in my work. Um, and so, as a result of that, I really highly recommend that people who are listening go out and get this text and read it, and think about the context of it and how it applies to our grander, wider exploration of magical texts. But yeah, um, I think it's a really important text to modern study. And thank you both so much for coming onto the show today to talk to me. Um, Jose, do you have any research or anything that you're working on next? Are you taking a well-deserved break from everything, or are you already working on the next project?
I wish I was taking a break. Look, I always have a long list of research to do and a long list of publications to write. Um, Currently, I have to take a break from writing because I was hired by the University of Coimbra to teach history to little children. So for the past months, I've been quite busy with that. And, it's not a bad thing. A job is important. But in the future, I have starting next year, I'll hopefully have time to first of all put my thesis into printable form, And then, besides this book that I found during my PhD, which is now published, I did find other books, and I do hope to, throughout the next couple of years, put them out gradually. Another book on treasure hunting that used to belong to a member of the royal household of Portugal. A very interesting book, and not only that, it's a treasure hunting book again, but this one we have the advantage of we know who the owner was, and the owner was also an author who wrote a manuscript that's also in the Portuguese National Library of his treasure hunting adventures. So we have a magic book that he owns, a magic treasure hunting book that he owned, and his stories of treasure hunting. So to put these two books together, I think will be a very cool publication to further this understanding of how treasure hunting functioned in European society in those days, and eventually also try to publish some these astral magic books I found in Spain that last year I was talking with Erzbet about, and a few other smaller publications, smaller texts and smaller prayers that I found throughout the Inquisition. So I have plenty of material to translate and publish and work. I just don't have time.
Yeah,
That's the plans for the immediate future.
Well, you're in very good company when it comes to learning about and being interested in astral magic, as both Brian and I have books out on the subject or soon to come out. But yeah, fantastic to hear that you're working in the same field, and I really look forward to reading more of your work in the future and having you back on the show. But yeah, Brian, do you have anything else that you're working on right now?
Well, yeah, I do have a handful of projects in the works that feature my translations and research in varying capacities. Although, honestly, I think it's probably too early to really have even a vague idea of when they might be appearing. So it's probably best to just hold off, not get people too excited right now. Uh, my all my previous works are available from Hadean and Revelor Press on everything from necromancy to astrology, and they can be found in the usual places. Most recently, I actually made my first professional writing contribution to a tabletop role-playing game book. It's called 101 Tales of Magic and Mystery, which it's a collection of system neutral tabletop role-playing adventure outlines, all based on the real history, folklore, and magical beliefs of Elizabethan England. So I was able to sneak in some fun references that I think listeners of this podcast might appreciate.
All right. Anything from Oberon?
No, but there are several authors that contributed to this book, and I know that there are allusions in that direction.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I'll have a look out for that. Yeah. Thank you both so much for coming onto the show today and talking about this wonderful contribution to the Cyprianic corpus and to our furthering our understanding of the grimoire tradition itself. So thank you both so much for coming on. Hope I see you both again soon.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. Thanks for having us, Matt.
See you.
That was José Leitão and Brian Johnson discussing their most recent publication, 7 Magic Hours of Cyprian the Mage, a study and translation of manuscript 174N155 from the Portuguese National Library, an Iberian book of pacts and treasure hunting. José's work has become monolithic in the field of Cyprianic books of magic, and it was truly excellent to get the opportunity to discuss the evolution of this most potent stream of the grimoire tradition with him and the podcast's favourite and most hardworking of guests, Brian Johnson. I especially loved how candid José was about how the discovery of this grimoire and its contents challenged his prior published research and established theories. And despite this, he pushed on with the plasticity of mind to adapt to new evidence. This is a rather rare thing in academic circles, and so José's willingness to renegotiate the boundaries of his work to progress this field of study is something that should be given the highest praise. The transmission of French texts to Spain and then into Portugal was also of particular interest to me, as well as how the contents of grimoires shapeshift and adapt to the cultures that they encounter through history, with this stream of the diabolic French Grand Grimoire becoming Cyprianic as it enters Iberian territory, much as the elements of the same French texts become Faustian upon entering Germany. Through this, we see how the myths of the land hold sway over the nature of magic. I know Brian caveats his translation by saying he's a little unsure of the grammar in some sections of the text, but still I think it's really fascinating to consider this a truly diabolic grimoire, which has the operator deny the magic of Adam, David, Solomon, and the Three Kings, making it uniquely anti-Solomonic in nature. As José mentions in the interview, this places the focus on Cyprian as the pagan mage as opposed to the latter converted Christian saint. We instead find a pact which is done directly with the spirits, without constraints, threats, or appeals to complex hierarchies of power. I strongly recommend readers interested in both the Cyprianic and the French diabolic streams of the European grimoire tradition spend time with this text to tease out its many fascinating implications. For more on both José and Brian, please look to the links in the description below. José has a YouTube channel, which I didn't know about, with some really fantastic presentations. So I recommend that you go and check those out and subscribe to his channel to support his work. If you have listened this far, then thank you so much for your continued support for Hadean Press and our global authorship. Please leave us a comment below, like, share, and subscribe for more just like this in the future. Our January episode will be a slight change from the norm, but I will explain more when the time comes. Our guest is a good friend of mine, so I am very much looking forward to our conversation. Thank you all so much for listening, and I wish you all the very happiest of New Year's. I have been your host, Matt Hadfield, and I will see you all again in the next one.